We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I'm Mark Angelides. We're joined once again for this next segment by Scott Cosenza, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor. Now, Scott, returning our attention to the cases that do not involve Donald Trump, of which there are many and whose import is great. Scott, what's up in the near term for the Supreme Court?
Yeah, there was a full slate of cases before before the attempt to restrict
Before
American
Trump took over the world.
Right. Yeah, so there are three big ones next week. The first up is Murthy or Murthy v. Missouri, which is about the Biden administration's attempt to either A, give guidance to social media outlets for which information they should publish, or to threaten and implicate and infringe upon Americans' First Amendment rights. And that's the contest. The Supreme Court granted an injunction basically against a lower court ruling that argued the Biden administration was infringing against Americans' First Amendment rights by communicating with social media and encouraging them to ban and restrict posts for vaccine skepticism, for instance, and other topics.
Let me just dig into that just for a second. So this is actually one of the occasions when it really is a First Amendment case, though, unlike the many that people say are First Amendment cases that really aren't, because this is a case of the government stepping in to try and limit speech rather than a private company
yes,
saying,
this is not
we
about,
don't
like,
want
Facebook
this or we don't want that.
Own saying, hey, we don't want vaccine skepticism posts on our platform. This is about Murthy is a Navy doctor in the Surgeon General's office. Anyway, this is about them going to a platform like a Facebook and saying, hey, this is the truth and this is not, and you should, restrict posts that don't quote unquote post the truth, for instance. So yes, to my mind, it is absolutely
genuine.
The question for the court will be whether or not there was a sufficient kind of hammer, right? Any government official can just say something that doesn't necessarily make it a First Amendment violation, but does the implication of, hey, or what, right? That's sort of the thing. And if there's an or what, or an implied or what, then I think the First Amendment is implicated, and that's what the fight's about.
I'm looking forward to that one playing out. Scott,
Yeah.
what else is up on the near-term docket?
The NRA versus Vullo case, which is a very close cousin to that, but instead involves the threat for financial regulation. So basically, financial regulators went to credit card companies and others and said, like, hey, you want to keep doing business with the NRA? That seems like bad business for you, buddy. Well, the implication there is, of course, if you depend on those regulators, to grease the skids of your operation, whether that's lending or any kind of financial transaction, which in this country is hyper regulated, you want those regulators on your side. And so the implication is that it's an imposition, an illegal imposition against the NRA's First Amendment rights and all of those of us Americans, really all Americans, if they're going to do that based on speech. In other words, if the regulators went to the banks because of the type of speech the NRA was engaging in and then wished for them to close the relationships down, close the NRA accounts down, the NRA is saying that's a violation of free speech. And the Biden administration is saying, no, that it's not. It's okay to do, presumably. If it was the NAACP's accounts that were threatened by a Republican administration, I suggest there would be demonstrations in the streets. But in this case, we'll see what happens.
To my mind, and of course, my mind is not legally trained in any nation or state or province. But it seems to me, I have watched a lot of mafioso movies, and I do happen to own every book that Mario Puzo has ever written. And The Godfather is about the third best one, I should point out. But to me, it seems as though what you have here are financial regulators, and they're essentially acting as enforcement or protection collecting goons saying, "Hey, you're loaning money to this guy. It'd be a shame if something happened to your credit bureau, your lending agency. It'd be a shame if we changed the regulations because you keep doing this." I mean,
Well,
that's how it seems to me.
I can tell you, Mark, since the Clinton administration, the anti-gunners have felt comfortable with a full court press against guns throughout all tentacles of the government. And so under the Clinton administration, for instance, one of the Cuomos, who was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, for instance, advanced gun control in public housing. So it's like wherever they can possibly have any sort of like, sometimes you'll be driving down the road and you'll see like a beautiful flower growing out of kind of a patch of concrete. And you'll think, oh, anywhere they can, life blooms wherever there's the potential for the purchase of it. Well, the same thing is true with an attempt to seize gun rights from Americans for the anti-gunners. Wherever they can get the tiniest of a foothold, they'll try for it.
All right. And what else do we have at the Supreme Court, Scott? What rounds out your trifecta here?
A drug war case called Diaz versus United States. And the war on drugs is really responsible for a massive declination in individual rights of Americans from its inception through to today. And this continues that arc. In the case of Diaz versus United States, a woman who crossed the border in a car that was laden with drugs claimed during her trial that she was unaware of the fact that it was laden with drugs. And there's reason to believe that it wasn't, that it might have been a boyfriend and some cartel activity that she was unaware of. Well, during the course of the trial, the government wishes to put forth an expert, or did put forth an expert that said, basically, we know that people are for instance, we know that people are often murdered by those closest to them, whether it be a family member or a business associate that's close in. But if you are charged with murdering a person you're close with, they can't just say, well, we know that people are often murdered by those closest to them, so that's why Mark, you should find guilt against Mark, which is essentially the ask against Ms. Diaz. And I think that it's a case that's, like, for instance, if we can extrapolate, why would this might be otherwise important beyond the drug war? And I think it's important enough within the context of the drug war to watch it. But let's say, for instance, they said, well, you're guilty of an insurrection because you were at the Capitol on January 6th. And you might say, I just went to hear the president speak and was interested in seeing the building. And then when people crashed into it, I just got swept up. And they imagine them then having an expert saying, well, only people that are committed to the overthrow of the government went into the building without ever actually having to accuse you of it and present evidence that was your purpose. But then you're going to be held, basically imputed guilt based upon this expert's testimony. So it's about whether or not this expert will be allowed to testify to sort of a general theme of somebody's behavior, even though they have no actual evidence about that person's behavior regarding those facts.
Yeah, it does seem a very slippery slope that you can say people who are like this tend to do this, because then we're essentially looking for convictions based on generalities, and that seems like
the drug war has done immeasurable damage to our liberties here in the United States, and this is another component of it.
Well, you can catch up with Scott's writings on each of the really fascinating Supreme Court cases on the pages of LibertyNation.com. Scott, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. My special thanks to Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's Economics Affairs Editor, and to Scott Cosenza, Liberty Nation's Legal Eagle. And of course, my thanks to you, the listeners out there in Radioland, who take the time to tune in, week out. You are appreciated. Thanks very much for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at LibertyNation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.